Chapter 10 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Manassas evacuated. Sunday, the 9th of March, was a day of swiftly succeeding emotions at the Executive Mansion. The news of the havoc wrought by the Merrimac in Hampton Roads the day before arrived in the morning, and was received with profound chagrin by the calmest spirits, and with something like consternation by the more excitable. But in the afternoon, astonishing tidings came to reverse the morning's depression. The first was of the timely arrival of the Monitor, followed shortly on the completion of the telegraph to Fort Monroe by the news of her battle and victory. The exultation of the government over this providential success was changed to amazement by the receipt of intelligence that the rebel batteries on the Potomac were already abandoned. And the tale of surprises was completed by the news which came in the evening that the Confederate army had abandoned their works at Manassas, retreating southward. General McClellan was with the President and the Secretary of War when this message arrived, and he received it, as might have been expected, with incredulity, which at last gave way to stupefaction. He started at once across the river, ostensibly to verify the intelligence, and issued an order that night for an immediate advance of the army upon Centreville and Manassas. In the elaborate report by which he strove a year after the fact to shift from himself the responsibility of all errors, occurs this remarkable sentence: "The retirement of the enemy towards Richmond had been expected as the natural consequence of the movement to the Peninsula, but their adoption of this course immediately on ascertaining that such a movement was intended, while it relieved me from the results of the undue anxiety of my superiors and attested the character of the design, was unfortunate in that the then almost impassable roads between our positions and theirs deprived us of the opportunity for inflicting damage usually afforded by the withdrawal of a large army in the face of a powerful adversary." This was the theory immediately adopted by himself, propagated among his staff, communicated to the Prince de Joinville, who published it in France on his return there, and to the Comte de Paris, who after 20 years incorporated it in his history, that the enemy, having heard of his scheme for going to the Peninsula through the indiscretion of the government, had suddenly taken flight from Manassas. General McClellan asserts this in his report a dozen times. He reiterates it as if he felt that his reputation depended upon it. If it is not true, then in the long contest with the President in regard to a direct attack from Washington, the President was right and McClellan was wrong. The straightforward narrative of General Johnston and the official orders and correspondence of the Confederate officers show that there is not the slightest foundation for this theory of General McClellan's. They show, on the contrary, that the rebel government nearly a month before this had concluded that Johnston's position was untenable, that Johnston had shared in the belief and had begun his preparations to retire on the 22nd of February, that instead of ascertaining McClellan's intention to move to the lower Chesapeake, he had been of the opinion that McClellan would advance upon the line designated by Mr. Lincoln because it was the best line for attack and the most difficult for the rebels to defend, that he knew McClellan's enormous superiority in numbers, and did not propose to risk everything in resisting him there, that on the 5th of March, having received information of unusual activity in our army in the direction of Dumfries, he gave his final orders, and on the 7th began to move. He proceeded with the greatest deliberation, writing to one of his generals on the 15th, "McClellan seems not to value time especially." His subordinates were equally convinced that the Confederate right was the object of the Union advance. Holmes wrote in that sense to Robert E. Lee on the 15th of March. Lee, who was then directing military operations in Richmond, answered him on the 16th, concurring in this view, recognizing the advantages of such a plan, and saying that he will advance upon our line as soon as he can, I have no doubt. Until the 18th of March, Johnston did not suspect that McClellan was not advancing to strike his right flank. He then fell back behind the Rapidan to guard against other contingencies. Even while our vast army was passing down the Potomac, he could not make out where it was going. So late as the early days of April, Jefferson Davis was in doubt as to McClellan's destination, and Johnston only heard of the advance upon Yorktown about the 5th of that month. By the very test, therefore, to which General McClellan appeals in the paragraph quoted above, his conduct during the autumn and winter stands finally condemned. By their contemporaneous letters and orders, by their military movements in an important crisis, by their well-considered historical narratives, the Confederate Government and generals have established these facts beyond all possibility of future refutation: that the plan for a direct attack, suggested by Lincoln and rejected by McClellan, was a sound and practicable one. It was the plan they expected and dreaded to see adopted, because it was the one easiest to accomplish and hardest to resist. When they fancied that they saw the Army of the Potomac preparing to move, it was this plan alone of which they thought, and they immediately gave up their position, as they had been for weeks preparing to do, at the first intimation of a forward movement. The long delay of 5 months, during 3 of which the roads were in unusually fine condition, during all of which the Union forces were as 3 to 1 of the enemy, remains absolutely without excuse. It can only be explained by that idiosyncrasy of General McClellan which led him always to double or treble the number of an enemy and the obstacles in his immediate vicinity. It is little blame to Confederate generals that they could not divine what General McClellan was doing with the grand army of the Union during the week that followed the evacuation of Manassas. No soldier could have been expected to guess the meaning of that promenade of a vast army to Centreville and Manassas and back to Alexandria. In spite of the impassable roads, they made the journey with ease and celerity. The question why the whole army was taken has never been satisfactorily answered. General McClellan's explanation afterwards was that he wanted the troops to have a little experience of marching and to get rid of their impedimenta. He claims in his report to have found on this excursion a full justification of his extravagant estimate of the enemy's force, and speaks with indignation of the calumnious stories of Quaker guns which were rife in the press at the time. Every one now knows how fatally false the estimate was, and as to the Quaker guns, this is what General Johnston says about them: "As we had not artillery enough for their works, and for the army fighting elsewhere at the same time, rough wooden imitations of guns were made and kept near the embrasures in readiness for exhibition in them. To conceal the absence of carriages, the embrasures were covered with sheds made of bushes. These were the Quaker guns afterwards noticed in Northern papers." Without further discussing where the fault lay, the fact is beyond dispute that when the evacuation of Manassas was known throughout the country, the military reputation of General McClellan received serious damage. No explanation made at the time, and we may add none made since then, could account satisfactorily for such a mistake as to the condition of the enemy, such utter ignorance as to his movements. The first result of it was the removal of General McClellan from the command of the armies of the United States. This resolution was taken by the President himself on the 11th of March. On that day he prepared the order known as President's War Order No. 3, and in the evening called together Mr. Seward, Mr. Chase, and Mr. Stanton, and read it to them. It was in these words: President's War Order No. 3, Executive Mansion, Washington, March 11, 1862. Major General McClellan, having personally taken the field at the head of the Army of the Potomac, until otherwise ordered, he is relieved from the command of the other military departments, he retaining command of the Department of the Potomac. Ordered further, that the departments now under the respective commands of Generals Halleck and Hunter, together with so much of that under General Buell as lies west of a north and south line indefinitely drawn through Knoxville, Tennessee, be consolidated and designated the Department of the Mississippi, and that until otherwise ordered, Major General Halleck have command of said department. Ordered also that the country west of the Department of the Potomac and east of the Department of the Mississippi be a military department to be called the Mountain Department, and that the same be commanded by Major General Fremont. That all the commanders of departments, after the receipt of this order by them respectively, report severally and directly to the Secretary of War, and that prompt, full, and frequent reports will be expected of all and each of them. Abraham Lincoln. All the members of the Cabinet present heartily approved the order. The President gave his reason for issuing it while General McClellan was absent from Washington, a reason indeed apparent in the opening words, which were intended to take from the act any appearance of disfavor. The General's intimate biographers have agreed that it was because the President was afraid to do it while the General was in Washington. The manner of the order, which was meant as a kindness, was taken as a grievance. Mr. Seward advised that the order be issued in the name of the Secretary of War, but this proposition met with a decided protest from Mr. Stanton. He said there was some friction already between himself and the General's friends, and he feared that the act, if signed by him, would be attributed to personal feeling. The President decided to take the responsibility. In a manly and courteous letter the next day, McClellan accepted the disposition thus made of him. On the 13th of March, at Fairfax Court House, General McClellan called together the 4 corps commanders who were with him and submitted to them for discussion the President's order of the 8th. The results of the council cannot be more briefly stated than in the following memorandum drawn up by the generals who took part in it. A council of the generals commanding Army Corps at the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac were of the opinion, 1. That the enemy, having retreated from Manassas to Gordonsville behind the Rappahannock and Rapidan, it is the opinion of the generals commanding Army Corps that the operations to be carried on will be best undertaken from Old Point Comfort between the York and James rivers, provided first that the enemy's vessel Merrimac can be neutralized. Second, that the means of transportation sufficient for an immediate transfer of the force to its new base can be ready at Washington and Alexandria to move down the Potomac. And third, that a naval auxiliary force can be had to silence or aid in silencing the enemy's batteries on the York River. Fourth, that the force to be left to cover Washington shall be such as to give an entire feeling of security for its safety from menace. Unanimous. 2. If the foregoing cannot be, the army should then be moved against the enemy behind the Rappahannock at the earliest possible moment, and the means for reconstructing bridges, repairing railroads, and stocking them with materials sufficient for supplying the army should at once be collected for both the Orange and Alexandria and Aquia and Richmond railroads. Unanimous. N.B. That with the forts on the right bank of the Potomac fully garrisoned, and those on the left bank occupied, a covering force in front of the Virginia line of 25,000 men would suffice. Keyes, Heintzelman, and McDowell. A total of 40,000 men for the defense of the city would suffice. Sumner. These conclusions of the council were conveyed to Washington, and the President on the same day sent back to General McClellan his approval and his peremptory orders for the instant execution of the plan proposed, in these words signed by the Secretary of War. President, having considered the plan of operations agreed upon by yourself and the commanders of Army Corps, makes no objection to the same, but gives the following directions as to its execution. First, leave such force at Manassas Junction as shall make it entirely certain that the enemy shall not repossess himself of that position and line of communication. Second, leave Washington entirely secure. Third, move the remainder of the force down the Potomac, choosing a new base at Fort Monroe, or anywhere between here and there, or at all events move such remainder of the army at once in pursuit of the enemy by some route. No commander could ask an order more unrestricted, more unhampered than this. Choose your own route, your own course, only go. Seek the enemy and fight him. Under the orders of John Tucker of the War Department, a fleet of transports had been preparing since the 27th of February. It is one of the many grievances mentioned by General McClellan in his report that this work was taken entirely out of his hands and committed to those of Mr. Tucker. He thus stops himself from claiming any credit for one of the most brilliant feats of logistics ever recorded. On the 27th of February, Mr. Tucker received his orders. On the 17th of March, the troops began their embarkation. On the 5th of April, Mr. Tucker made his final report, announcing that he had transported to Fort Monroe from Washington, Perryville, and Alexandria 121,500 men, 14,592 animals, 1,150 wagons, 44 batteries, 74 ambulances, besides pontoon bridges, telegraph materials, and the enormous quantity of equipage, etc., required for an army of such magnitude. The only loss, he adds, of which I have heard is 8 mules and 9 barges, which latter went ashore in a gale within a few miles of Fort Monroe, the cargoes being saved. He is certainly justified in closing his narrative with these words: I respectfully but confidently submit that, for economy and celerity of movement, this expedition is without a parallel on record. The first corps to embark was Heintzelman's. He took with him from General McClellan the most stringent orders to do nothing more than to select camping grounds, send out reconnaissances, engage guides and spies, but to make no important move in advance. The other forces embarked in turn, McDowell's corps being left to the last, and before it was ready to sail, General McClellan himself started on the 1st of April with the headquarters on the steamer Commodore, leaving behind him a state of things that made it necessary to delay the departure of McDowell's troops still further. In all the orders of the President, it had been clearly stated that, as an absolute condition precedent to the army being taken away to a new base, enough troops should be left at Washington to make that city absolutely safe, not only from capture, but from serious menace. The partisans of General McClellan then and ever since then have contended that, as Washington could not be seriously attacked without exposing Richmond to capture, undue importance was attached to it in these orders. It would be a waste of words to argue with people who place the political and strategic value of these two cities on a level. The capture of Richmond without the previous virtual destruction of the rebel armies would have been, it is true, an important achievement, but the seizure of Washington by the rebels would have been a fatal blow to the Union cause. General McClellan was in the habit of saying that if the rebel army should take Washington while he was at Richmond, they could never get back. But it might be said that the general who would permit Washington to be taken could not be relied on to prevent the enemy from doing what they liked afterwards. Mr. Lincoln was unquestionably right in insisting that Washington must not only be rendered safe from capture, but must also be without the possibility of serious danger. This view was adopted by the Council of Corps Commanders, who met on the 13th of March at Fairfax Court House. They agreed unanimously upon this principle, and then, so as to leave no doubt as to details, 3 of the 4 gave the opinion that after the forts on the Virginia side were fully garrisoned and those on the Maryland side occupied, a covering force of 25,000 men would be required. The morning after General McClellan had sailed for Fort Monroe, The Secretary of War was astonished to hear from General James S. Wadsworth, the military governor of the District of Washington, that McClellan had left him present for duty only 19,000 men, and that from that force he had orders to detach 8 good regiments. He further reported that his command was entirely inadequate to the important duty to which it was assigned. As General Wadsworth was a man of the highest intelligence, courage, and calm judgment, the President was greatly concerned by this emphatic statement. Orders were at once given to General E. A. Hitchcock, an accomplished veteran officer on duty at the War Department, and to Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas to investigate the statement made by General Wadsworth. They reported the same night that it would require 30,000 men to man and occupy the forts, which, with the covering force of 25,000, would make 55,000 necessary for the proper defense of the city, according to the judgment of the Council of Corps Commanders. They confirmed the report of Wadsworth that his efficient force consisted of 19,000, from which General McClellan had ordered 8 regiments away. They therefore concluded that the requirement of the President that the city should be left entirely secure had not been fully complied with. In accordance with this report, the President directed that General McDowell's corps should not be sent to the Peninsula until further orders. End of chapter 10.